So we have two really delicious stories today that our lectionary puts together in such a wonderfully compatible way. They build on one another and they inform one another, which is the best way that we could possibly have. These two stories are about disruption. Disruption in expectations. Disruption in feeling entitled and not getting what we want. Disruption in the habits of our lives for Jonah as well as the laborers. But it's also about disposition and character. God's disposition and character compared to our disposition and character. Jonah is disrupted by God's amazing, abounding grace, angry that God is so generous and merciful towards the Ninevites, who in Jonah's book are completely undeserving and unentitled to God's mercy. The laborers, too, in the vineyard who've worked all day are angry because the settled order of things is disrupted. They are angry because they feel they deserve something more than those who only worked but an hour. But the point of these stories, I think, is not about our disposition and character, but about God's. Now, for those of us who are deeply attached to the tit-for-tat world of competition, of winners and losers, the saved and the unsaved for some of our brothers and sisters, this message can be frustrating and downright disappointing. We want to just take the table and go, "Rah!" You see, the kingdom of the world has bent our default settings over time, not towards cooperation and community, but towards competition. This is especially true when we see others as being disconnected from ourselves, when we see others as those people who do that over there, and not as an extension of us who do things this way and are open to other ways. Brene Brown writes in her book, Daring Greatly, that we are hardwired to connect with others. It's what gives purpose and meaning to our lives. And without it, there is suffering. And friends, we know something of suffering in this world. God calls us children, and we treat one another as enemies. God calls us partners, and we act as competitors. God calls us beloved, and we treat one another as strangers. Competition. You see, if we spend our lives reckoning whether folks are good or bad or worthy or unworthy, valuable or unvaluable, deserving or undeserving, we miss an opportunity to live in God's kingdom right now, here on earth. And there's a huge price to pay for living this way. One dimension of that price is constant vigilance. As long as we place ourselves in the judgment seat, we'll always be competitors. There will always be an us and a them, and we'll never live as God created us to live, as brothers and sisters, as children made in the image of God. Another cost is to live without forgiveness. We talked about that last week. Living with the tyranny of the grudge, of nursing resentments, and of judging others. As long as we try to place ourselves above others, we'll simply suspect others as being as desperate as we are to win. And as long as we view the world as being full of people in desperate need to win over and against one another, we will find it very hard to accept the good news of Jesus that's articulated in this Sunday's gospel. That we are called, you and me, to be heralds of a gospel where everybody's in. That we are called to proclaim a reality where everybody wins, where there's enough love to go around, and a world where cooperation and collaboration leads to abundance and peace for all of God's people. That means for everyone. My dad, George III, is a master storyteller. Wherever he goes, no matter who he's with, friends or colleagues or strangers even, he's the guy who inevitably winds up surrounded by a big group of folks, attentively hanging on every last word he says, attentively hanging on his word, delighting in the joke itself as much as they delight in my dad's joy in telling it. These moments are truly my dad living the most George that he was created to live, the most George he'd ever been before, living in the way that God created him, delighting, sharing laughter, spreading joy. And the best thing about my dad's joke telling, the gift of his joke telling, which is a gift, is that as much as he loves to make others laugh, he also loves to make room for other folks to step in and tell their own jokes, encouraging and laughing along with them, even when the other joke tellers aren't nearly as good as he is. It's like he knows that there's all the more laughter and all the more joy and life-giving, life-affirming for every person who joins in on the fun. He isn't diminished when somebody else tells a really good joke. It's like he knows that there's enough laughter in the world to go around for every joke, even the bad ones. In fact, the more jokes that are told, the more delight and joy for us all. He's generous that way. It's the same way with God's blessing. God's blessing and love are not like slices of a pie with less of it left for me when God blesses and loves someone else. It's more like a really good joke. All the more life-giving and affirming, all the more delightful for every person who shares in it. God is infinitely generous, and God showers us with blessings and hope and love and wisdom without the slightest regard for our deserving. That's what we call divine injustice. We don't get what we deserve. And that is good news indeed. We all forget that sometimes, I think. Sometimes, like Jonah, we end up angry at God for being merciful and generous toward those we reckon as undeserving. Or we get angry and we pick up our toys out of the sandbox and we tromp off and go our own way when we get angry, just because God doesn't go along with our plans. And just like the workers in the vineyard who cast the evil eye, and I don't know if you've ever received the evil eye, but I certainly have been the recipient of more than my share of the evil eye, we end up cursing God for loving so lavishly and forgiving so much. Those grumbling workers are right in their assessment that the landowner is not treating everyone in the vineyard as fair. They're right. Employers are supposed to pay each worker according to what each deserves. But these 8 o'clock workers are so concerned with receiving their fair wages compared to what the later workers receive that they're missing the invitation implicit in the landowner's generosity. The invitation not to receive wages, not to receive wages earned, but to receive blessings shared. The invitation to be more like family, more like partners than employees. It is an invitation to see the others as collaborators, as cooperators, as family. I think it's why earlier in Matthew's gospel, Jesus links being children of your Father in heaven with loving and blessing neighbor and enemy alike. Jesus chooses cooperation over competition precisely because we are to live and love the way that the Father does in heaven, forgiving one another, loving one another, loving our neighbors as ourselves, participating in God's own triune spirit of cooperation and interdependence, not giving according to what people deserve, but returning a blessing for a curse. Not an eye for an eye, but turning the other cheek, forgiving 77 times 7 times. Jesus really would have us live as brothers and sisters, as a family, as though we really do believe and desire God's kingdom to come, and that God's will be done on earth as it is in heaven. What does that look like? It looks like helping one another recognize our value and realizing our dignity as human beings. It looks like recognizing that we are all connected, all of us interdependent brothers and sisters, and we all have something to contribute, a voice, a prayer, a hug, a meal. It looks like recognizing that we are all in the vineyard together. And so it means looking at us differently. It means seeing everyone as valuable, regardless of what we do, or how much we do, or how much we give, or how much we pray, or even how and when we prefer to worship. Because when it comes right down to it, we are all of us the 5 o'clock worker. We've all shown up late. The only one who was here in the beginning, setting it all up, the only one who deserves a full day's wage is Jesus. He's the one who was hired at dawn, and he's the one who's done the heavy lifting so that we can simply receive the blessing of the laborers, regardless of whether or not we deserve it. Because we don't. That's the delicious irony here. We don't deserve it. Any of it. But that's not how God's kingdom works. It isn't about deserving. It isn't about winning or losing. It's about being loved. Being loved beyond our merit. Being loved beyond our measure. Being loved beyond our deserving, loved in spite of our shortcomings, loved because we were born of love, created to be loved, created to be love. These two stories are not about what is acceptable to Jonah or to the laborers. They get angry and they seek what is fair, but in God's kingdom, fairness is a beggar. These stories are about what is good and acceptable to God, and they reflect God's own disposition and character as our own aspiration. They serve to disabuse us from any belief that God's agenda must follow our agenda. But it also stresses God's mercy and blessing, and God's freedom to dispense this mercy and blessing to anyone and to everyone. In these stories, God is challenging Jonah and the laborers and us, St. Patrick's, for believing that God owed them something because they were faithful, because those who grumbled have borne the burden of the day and the scorching heat, and they should be entitled to something more than their brothers who worked only 1 hour, because that's only fair. And if God's way was fair, we'd be in a heap of trouble. If God's way was fair, we'd be lost without any hope of being found. If God's way was fair, the Rock of Ages would be a millstone around our necks instead of a cornerstone. And if God's way were fair, we wouldn't have a Christ who suffered death on a cross so that we wouldn't have to. God's way ain't fair. And ain't that just like God?